Test. Okay, we're good. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So I know some of you have been in different classes, and so we're in the middle of Hosea, and so you may not really know what's going on, which is okay. We'll be in Hosea this week and next, and then we'll start a new book after that. So we're in Hosea chapter 12. I think we left off at verse 11. We'll probably get through 12 and 13 tonight, and that'll just leave 14 for the last week, or for next week, I should say. So in chapter 12, as B mentioned last week, this kind of gets redundant. He starts saying the same things over and over again. A lot of it is. But as you read through it, just kind of bear in mind that Hosea prophesied over a very long period of time. I think I mentioned last week that he says he prophesied over a certain number of kings, and if you add up the maximum reign for those kings, it would be about 100 years that he prophesied. Obviously, he probably didn't prophesy that long, but the shortest possible time he would have prophesied would have been 30 to 40 years, somewhere in there. So as you're reading his book of 14 chapters, it's kind of like a musician where, they have a bunch of albums, but then they'll put out their greatest hits album. And that's what this book is kind of like. You're getting to see kind of his greatest hits over 40 years or so. And so that's why some of it sounds kind of repetitious, because it's the same message that he's delivering over and over and over to them. And of course, they ignore all of it to their own doom. But that's why it does sound somewhat repetitious after you go through it over and over again. Okay, so we're in verse 11 of chapter 12. He says, "Though Gilead has idols, surely they are vanity. Though they sacrifice bulls in Gilgal, indeed their altars shall be heaps in the furrows of the fields." What he's talking about in this chapter is he kind of is reiterating. He starts off sort of with a positive message about how God could take them back. But then he starts going back into their sins again and all the different sins that they have. And so that's kind of what he's in the middle of right now in the verse 11 through the rest of the chapter. And so he talks about the idols that they have. So he has three main issues with the people, Hosea does, that you read about over and over and over through the book. One is their dependence on idols instead of dependence on God. So they're involved in Baal worship, which is a violation of the covenant. They also make foreign alliances with other countries like Assyria and Egypt that they're not supposed to do. They're supposed to trust in God. And then thirdly is their lack of knowledge of who God really is, because they're priests and they are not teaching the people properly who God is, and so they have kind of drifted away from God without really realizing it. So he's hitting here on the idols again, and there is a little bit of a play on some of the words here. The word Gilgal, which is the second place he mentions Gilead and then he mentions Gilgal. Gilgal literally means a circle or a heap of stones, and so he's making a pun here when he says they sacrifice bulls at a city called a heap of stones. And then the next line, he says, their altars shall become heaps of stones in the furrows of the field. So what the farmers would do is they'd pick up all the stones out of the field so you could use the field, and they'd set them on the side of the field in a little stack or a pile. And what he's saying is your altars are going to become like these worthless stacks of rocks on the side of the field, okay? So, all this stuff you put your stock in, you create these idols that you want to worship and sacrifice Baal, or sacrifice to Baal. They're going to be torn down when Assyria comes in. They're going to become useless and worthless. And all this stuff you put all your trust in is going to be taken away. Verse 12, he says, Jacob fled to the country of Syria. So if you remember back, if you were here last week, we talked a lot about Jacob, because Jacob was some of the imagery he was using at the beginning of the chapter. And so he's kind of going back to the idea of Jacob here. So he said Jacob fled to the country of Syria, or your translation may say Aram, same place. Israel served for a spouse, and for a wife he tended sheep. And so what he's kind of going back to the idea of is, okay, Jacob acquired great wealth, but he didn't do it on his own. Okay, God gave this to him. So God gave him his 2 wives. God gave him a lot of the wealth that he got over time. God also helped him through these difficult situations. So his time with Laban was not all positive, if you remember the story. And so God helped him through this situation. And the reason he's mentioning this is to say that Israel currently is a wealthy country, like Jacob was a wealthy man, but God gave it all to you. But you're attributing your wealth to Baal, not to God, or to your own abilities, not to God giving it to you. And you're about to get yourself involved in a lot of trouble with these foreign countries that you're courting, Assyria in particular. And he's saying, I will get you out of this situation, but you have to put your trust in me. You can't put your trust in Egypt to get you out of trouble with Assyria or vice versa. You have to put your trust in me. And that's not what they're going to do, unfortunately. So verse 13, just for a fun fact, does anybody know what the English name Jacob actually is? So Yaakov is Hebrew for Jacob. But what English New Testament name is Jacob? Okay, it's James. James and Jacob are the same name, okay? So just some fun fact, just for kicks. All right, so my middle name's James. Any other James in here? Okay, so I guess the bottom line is, since the name Jacob means deceiver, you can't trust either of the two of us. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So the name James is from the name Jacob. All right, verse 13, it says, by a prophet the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt. He's referring to Moses, that God used Moses to get you out of Egypt in the past. And then it says, by a prophet he was preserved. He may be referencing Joshua there, that Joshua kind of kept the country going after they got out of Egypt and after Moses died. But what happened after all that? Ephraim provoked him to anger most bitterly. Sorry, I have a sinus infection, so I'm kind of struggling to breathe a little bit. All right, Ephraim provoked him to anger most bitterly. Therefore his Lord will leave the guilt of his bloodshed upon him and return his reproach upon him. So what he's talking about is, God did all this. God brought you out of captivity, but you did not listen to what God had to say. So this last verse actually is verse 1 of chapter 13 in the Hebrew Bible. It kind of flows a little bit better with the next chapter, which is why it's there. But in English, it's the last verse of this chapter. And so what he's talking about is Ephraim, instead of following God's commands, they provoked God to anger by doing what they wanted to do instead of what God wanted. So why is he picking on Ephraim? Well, Ephraim is the biggest tribe of Israel, the 10 northern tribes. It's the largest. It's the most powerful. It's also the wealthiest. And it's the tribe that has some pretty famous people that came from it. Let me glance at my notes real quick. I didn't write it down here. Let me think off the top of my head. It's I know Jeroboam. Here we go. Jeroboam the first is from Ephraim. So the very first king of Israel when the country split, he is from Ephraim. Joshua is also from Ephraim. So you have several prominent figures who are from Ephraim. And so he's making the point that, Ephraim was sort of the leader of the 10 northern tribes. As a tribe, it was kind of the most prominent and the leader. And so it's standing for the country as a whole. And he says, you didn't obey me, you provoked me to anger. And as a result, God is going to leave the New King James says the guilt of his bloodshed. The ESV says their blood guilt. And what he's referencing, this is a particular type of sin that according to the covenant, Sorry, I may have to blow my nose here. According to the covenant, for this sin, the punishment is death for this sin. And he's probably talking about how they killed the prophets. So he's saying, because you provoked me to anger, you didn't listen to my prophets, you killed a lot of my prophets, I am not going to withdraw this guilt from you. So God suffered through them for a lot of things. But he's saying that at this point, I'm not going to overlook this stuff anymore. And he's going to let them be punished for it. And so the punishment for their sin is death, okay? So he's going to, the last line, he's going to return his reproach upon him. Okay, so that's the last of chapter 12. Does anybody have any questions on 12? I know we kind of rushed through the end of that. Okay, 13 picks up with the same kind of idea, because like I said, that last verse really goes with this next chapter. Okay, so chapter 13, verse 1, it says, when Ephraim spoke, trembling, he exalted himself in Israel. And what he's talking about is when the country first started, Ephraim was a prominent figure as a tribe. And so when Ephraim would talk, everybody else would listen because it had a lot of influence on the other tribes. Like I mentioned, Joshua was from there, Jeroboam the first was from there. So it's a very prominent tribe. Shechem is in Ephraim, which is the place of the first royal residence for Israel, was in Shechem. And so it's your main sort of tribe for the 10 northern tribes. And so what he's saying is you were a prominent figure, and when you spoke, people would listen to you. But, the third line here of verse 1, but when he offended through Baal worship, he died. So in other words, you started off strong, but then you got yourself caught up into Baal worship, and that's led you to your death. So who brought in the Baal worship? Jeroboam the first brought it in, so he was the first king, but then it was perpetuated by basically all of the kings of Israel over the time, particularly with Ahab and Jezebel. They really ramped it up as well. And so over time, things just got worse and worse and worse, and the people fell further and further and further away from God as they got involved in the Baal worships. Okay, verse 2. Now they sin more and more, and they have made for themselves molded images. So their sin is multiplying on top of each other, and they start to make molded images, or idols, another word for idols. The idols of their silver, according to their skill, all of it is the work of craftsmen. They say to them, let the men who sacrifice kiss the calves. So what he's just talking about is he's just reiterating their Baal worship, how they are worshiping these idols, and he's making fun of them in the sense that these idols, you make them yourself, right? So if I make a little idol and then I fall down and I worship it, I'm really just worshiping myself, right? Because it's just something I made, okay? Now, obviously, they would have trade guilds, and you would go to a professional to buy your idol. So you probably wouldn't make your own idol. You would go buy it from somebody else that made it. But the idea is the same. A human made it, so you're worshiping something that a human made, okay? Which is pretty foolish, but do we not do the same thing in a lot of ways? So you see this all around us all the time, and maybe not in the form of a little figurine that you fall down and worship, but people fall down and worship in their own way, humans or things that humans do. A lot of celebrities make the media all the time, and that becomes something that people get caught up in, and they follow that kind of stuff all the time, and that becomes a large part of their life, is following these celebrities or other people or politics or whatever the case may be. And you get caught up in it, and that kind of crowds God out, and that becomes the focus of what you spend your time on. And so he's just chastising them for that. And that last line about kissing the calves, that just means it's an idiom for worshiping something. So they worship this particular thing. Okay, verse 3, what's going to be the result of them doing this? They shall be like the morning cloud, and like the early dew that passes away, like chaff off from a threshing floor, and like smoke from a chimney. In other words, all four of those lines, those are things that don't last long, right? So dew passes away within an hour or two in the morning. The smoke from a chimney just kind of, filters away very quickly. So what he's saying to them is, this foolishness you've got yourself caught up into is going to lead to your own destruction, okay? You're going to pass away from history very quickly because of your stupidity, okay? So how long had Israel been a country at this point? Anybody want to throw out a figure? We'll just say somewhere between 200 and 250 years, okay? How long has our country been around? Same, okay? Israel's the same age as us right now, right? Who's in better shape? This Israel or this United States? What? Oh, B's going with a tie. I guess it's in the eye of the beholder what answer you want to give it. Neither one of them are in good shape. Okay, I think we can all agree on that. Neither one's in good shape. So Israel and the United States are roughly the same age as a country. They are both going full speed in the wrong direction. And God is just saying to Israel, you as a country, you're about to disappear from history, okay? You're going to be like dew, you're going to be like smoke, you're going to be like chaff. Your end is fast approaching, okay? I don't know what our future holds, but I hope we can turn it around. But at least for Israel's case, God flat out told them, your end's fast approaching. And we know from history that they do come to an end. Don't know when Hosea wrote this particular line, but probably within 10 years or something of when he said this is when they came to an end, okay? So verse 4, it says, yet I am the Lord your God. God's still saying he is their God, okay? So he's writing it out to the end, giving them a chance to repent, even though he knows they're not going to. So he says, I am the Lord your God, ever since the land of Egypt, and you shall know no God but me, for there is no Savior besides me. So notice what he's kind of doing here. He's hitting on the fact of who he is versus who Baal is, okay? So who brought them out of Egypt? Yahweh or Baal? Yahweh. Who are they supposed to know and know only? Yahweh or Baal? Yahweh. Who is the only Savior, Yahweh or Baal? Yahweh, okay? So Yahweh is who they're supposed to be worshiping. Yahweh is who they're supposed to be giving their life to. Yahweh is who they're supposed to be giving credit for taking them out of captivity. And yet, they've turned their back on Yahweh, and they want to give all the credit to Baal, okay? And so it's a very stark contrast between their reality and their perception, okay? Their perception is Baal's doing all this stuff and Yahweh's kind of there in the background like Santa Claus, when in reality Baal is fake and Yahweh's the one doing all this, okay? And so he's trying to get them to come back to God because they have left God as their only deity that they're worshiping. And as you keep going, verse 5, I knew you in the wilderness, which is talking about the wilderness after they left Egypt, in the land of great drought. It's the same thing, same place. So he's going back to this time when God brought them out of Egypt. Verse 6, when they had pasture, they were filled. So what he's talking about now is, okay, I got you out of there. I got you into Canaan. What did you do when you got into Canaan? Well, when they got into the Canaan, verse 6, when they had pasture, so when you finally got settled, you had pasture, you were filled. They were filled and their heart was exalted, therefore they forgot me. Okay, so what do most people do? When do most people really focus on God? When things are going well or when things are going bad? When they're going bad, right? So They were sort of in to their covenant with God when things were bad in the wilderness and so forth. Off and on, they did what God wanted. But once they got into Canaan and they settled and they had their own land and they could get their own produce and so forth, they kind of forgot about God, okay? And not only did they forget about God, but they started chasing after Baal, okay? And so God is reminding them that I did all this for you, and yet you forgot me, okay? Verse 7, so what is God going to do to them as a result of them forgetting him, okay? He's going to do to them what the covenant said he would do to them. Now remember, they signed this agreement with God in the wilderness, right? Okay, so God presented them a covenant, and what was their response when God gave them the covenant? We agree, okay? That's the short version. We agree, okay? You will be our God and we will be your people, all right? That was their agreement. Well, part of the covenant is blessings. You do this and I will do this for you. But part of the covenant is curses, which is you don't do this and I will do this to you in return. Or if you do these things I tell you not to do, this is also what you'll get in return, okay? So one of the big things that God said was, you shall have no other gods before me. And they ignored it, okay? So this is their punishment, or part of the punishment. And the covenant specifically says that God, part of his payment is he will use wild animals to come in and harm them, okay? Now this is figurative, what we're about to read, but it is in the covenant this way too. So verse 7, so I will be to them like a lion, like a leopard by the road I will lurk. I will meet them like a bear deprived of her cubs. I will tear open their rib cage, and there I will devour them like a lion. The wild beast shall tear them. So the three most feared animals in the Canaan-Palestine area at that time were the lion, leopard, and bear, okay? Those animals don't all live there anymore, but they did back at that time, okay? So he's picking the three most feared animals of the area to say that I'm going to be like those animals to you, okay? I'm going to come in and basically destroy you because you have broken our covenant that we had with each other, okay? All right, so verse 9, O Israel, you are destroyed, but your help is from me, okay? So their future is bleak, but if they want to turn it around, who do they have to appeal to, okay? Don't appeal to Egypt. Don't appeal to Assyria. I'm going to be the only person who can get you out of this at this point, okay? All right, so verse 10, I will be your king. Where is any other? That he may save you in all your cities, and your judges to whom you said, give me a king and princes. Okay, so what he's talking about, and the next verse will go with it. I'll just go ahead and read the next verse and we'll talk about it. It says, verse 11, I gave you a king in my anger and took him away in my wrath. He's going all the way back to the start of the monarchy. If you remember, who was supposed to be the head of the country? Yahweh, right? Wasn't supposed to be a human over the country. The head of the country is God, okay? But that didn't satisfy them. That didn't make them happy. They wanted a human king. Despite all of the things God said to them through Samuel, this is what's going to happen if you get a king, and they said, sure, sign us up, okay? Which is what we do too. So they got a king, and maybe one day I'll teach a class on how they chose a king, why they got the king they got. It's pretty interesting when you look at the language and all of it, but anyway, that's for a different time. They got a doofus, okay? Intentionally got a doofus. All right, he goes all the way back to the beginning, and he says, I didn't want you to have a king. You weren't supposed to have a king, but I gave you one because you begged for it, okay? But notice he says, I gave you a king in my anger, okay? And in my wrath, I take away your kings, okay? So how many kings had been king over Israel up until this point? If you go back to Saul all the way down to the last king of Israel, which is Hoshea, that is, I think it's 23. Let me see. Yeah, 23 kings from Saul all the way to Hoshea, which means you have 20 kings that are just over Israel after the kingdom split, okay? So that would be Jeroboam the first down to Hoshea for the kingdom of Israel. So how did all these kings fare? Well, bad, basically. The first three kings, you can argue, had some good and some bad. Saul, not the greatest. David and Solomon, solid, with some obvious missteps along the way. But overall, decent as human rulers go. But Jeroboam the first through Hoshea, absolute disaster. And how did the dynasties go? So there were 4 dynasties in Israel, meaning, you had a king, and then their son reigned, and then their grandson reigned, and maybe their great-grandson reigned. So your 4 dynasties are, the first king of each dynasty would be Jeroboam the first. The second one is Baasha. The third one is Omri. And the fourth one is Jehu. The last of each of those dynasties, the last king in those dynasties were assassinated. And during Hoshea's reign, 3 of the kings get assassinated. During Hosea's time as a prophet, 3 of the kings get assassinated, okay? So the monarchy as a whole is a failure, and it's a disaster, okay? And God told them up front that it's going to be that way, and they didn't listen. They wanted to do what they wanted to do. So verse 11, I gave you a king in my anger, and I took him away in my wrath, okay? So the last king is going to be taken away in God's wrath, and their country is not going to exist anymore, okay? Now, is something to stop and think about for a second? What's more important? The nation of Israel at this time or the church? God didn't want a human over the nation of Israel, and when there was one, he was angry, and it was his wrath that raged out against it. So what happens when mankind puts a human over the church? How do you think God responds to that? So when you look around at denominations and they have councils or they have a single individual over whatever, if God felt angry about a human being over a country, how does he feel about an appointed human over something that his own son that came and died is supposed to be the head of? So just stop and think about that a little bit as you contemplate other churches that may be out there. It's just something to think about. Okay, verse 12. The iniquity of Ephraim is bound up. That's legal language, meaning I've wrote down all your stuff on a legal document. I know all your sins. They're going to come back and haunt you. Verse 12, the second line, his sin is stored up. Verse 13, the sorrows of a woman in childbirth, shall come upon him. He is an unwise son, for he should not stay long where children are born. There's 2 metaphors in that verse, and it's New King James is a little wonky on how it says it. The first metaphor is, the first one is the mother who is in labor but cannot deliver, okay? So if you're a mother in labor but you can't deliver, particularly back at that time where there is no real modern medicine, you might call that a distressing situation, right, to say the least. So this is a bad situation that he's using as a metaphor for Ephraim. But the second metaphor is the child inside the womb. And he's basically saying Ephraim is like, I know the kid in the womb doesn't really know what's going on, but he's saying if the kid knew what was going on, the kid should know that they're supposed to come out, right? You don't stay in there forever. And so he's saying that the Ephraim is like a son who doesn't want to be born, doesn't want to exit, and that's foolishness. Basically what he's saying is Ephraim is in a bad situation like a mother who can't deliver. On one hand, it's a bad situation. On the other hand, Ephraim is foolish, like a kid who doesn't want to be delivered, okay? So it's two metaphors at the same time. But what is the end result of a mother and child that can't successfully go through childbirth? Especially at this time. Death for both of them, right? Okay. So what is he saying is coming for you, Ephraim? Death. Okay, death is knocking on your door, all right, so verse 14, I will ransom them from the power of the grave. I will redeem them from death. O death, I will be your plagues. O grave, I will be your destruction. Pity is hidden from my eyes. What he's saying is, let me back up for a second. In ancient Near Eastern religions, mythology, some religions think that the certain deities have no ability beyond the grave, or you may have a separate deity that reigns beyond death, in other words, depending on what religion you're looking at and so forth. So did the Israelites believe that God had power beyond death once you went into what they call Sheol? They probably did, but some of them maybe they didn't, depending on how they were influenced by the other religions around them and so forth. But what God is saying to them is, I have power over the grave, whether you live or die. I have power over where you go after you die. And then he calls out to death and says, death, What he's saying is I have power over your life and your death. I have power over what happens to you after you die. So then God talks to death and says to death, the New King James is kind of weird. Let me read it to you in the ESV. It might be a little more clear. Let me find it. 14. The ESV says, O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your sting? In other words, God is calling out to both death and to Sheol and says, you know what? I've got power over death. I have power over Sheol, but death and Sheol, do your worst to them. I'm done with these people, okay? If you want to take them, do whatever you want to with them. In Sheol, I'm done. I'm checking out. And you can tell that by the last line. The last line of 14, it says, pity is hidden from my eyes. I'm not pitying you anymore, okay? Your sins are going to get you now. I am withdrawing. I am letting whatever happens happen. I'm not saving you anymore, okay? Which is a hard pill to swallow. What if God said that to us? I don't want you anymore. What if he said that? Thankfully, he sent his son to die, so we don't have to hear that unless we want to hear that. It's our choice whether we hear that. But that is the last thing you want to hear, is that God doesn't want you and that he has no pity for you anymore. All right, verse 15. Though he is fruitful among his brethren, and that's a play off the name of Ephraim. Ephraim's name means to be fruitful or fruitful, and so it's sort of mocking Ephraim here. So though he is fruitful among his brethren, meaning he is the most prosperous of the tribes, It says, an east wind shall come, the wind of the Lord shall come up from the wilderness. So he's saying that something is coming from the east, and it's going to cross the wilderness to get to you. What is east? What is coming from the east? Assyria. Okay, Assyria is east of Palestine, and they'll come up the Fertile Crescent, but if you went by the way the crow flies, they would literally come across the wilderness or the desert. And so he's saying something is coming for you from the east, and we know that is to be Assyria. And what's going to happen when they get there? Well, this is what's going to happen. His springs shall become dry, his fountains shall be dried up. He shall plunder the treasury of every desirable prize. So when Assyria is going to get there, they're going to wipe out everything, all this wealth that you think you have, all this prosperity, all these idols, all these places you worship and do all this fake worship. It's all going down the drain when Assyria gets here. And then it says, verse 16, Samaria is held guilty. If you don't remember, Samaria is the capital city of Israel. So he's saying Samaria is held guilty, for she has rebelled against her God. They shall fall by the sword, their infants shall be dashed in pieces, and their women with child ripped open. Okay, so did this come to pass? Yeah, it did. Okay, so Assyria is the most notorious bully of the ancient Near East. And when they came in to destroy you, they came in to destroy you. Okay, they had no mercy. They would not think twice about killing women and children. They would not think twice about killing pregnant women. All this would happen over time. When did this happen? Maybe as little as 5 or 10 years from when Hosea is saying this. We don't know the exact year Hosea is saying this, but in 733, I think, part of Galilee and Gilead are taken captive into Assyria, and then Assyria pauses, and then they come back in 720. In the 720s, but the city eventually falls in 722 or 721, depending on which date you look at. And so the city of Samaria is put under siege, and then it falls in 722 or 721, and that's the end of Israel ever. They're completely wiped out of history after that. So what happens to the city of Samaria, or all of Israel, basically? Well, after the country falls, they become a vassal territory of Assyria. And the way Assyria would do things is they would take a lot of the people captive and prisoner back to either to Assyria or some other territory that they own, and they would just disperse you. They wouldn't take you to a single place. They'd split you up so that you couldn't form a gang and fight back against them. So that you would get split up, and they'd send some of you here, some of you there. And then what they would do, but they would leave some of the people there in Israel, so they weren't all taken captive. And what they would do is they would take people from their other places that they controlled and bring them in and dump them there, okay? So what you would end up getting is a mixed people in Israel, some of the Jews left behind, but then they would bring in people from all across the Assyrian Empire and drop them in there. And so it became an Assyrian territory with a mixed group of people. The city of Samaria itself got destroyed. It was eventually rebuilt around the time of Herod, but it's not the same name. I don't think this name shows up in the New Testament, but for bonus points, anybody know what the name of the city becomes? It's Sebaste. Okay, now I don't think it's still called that today. I think it's got an Arabic name today if you go over there. Do you know, Steve, off the top of your head? I think it goes by an Arabic name now, so, but you can go to the ruins and stuff of Sebaste, Samaria, if you want to. Anyway, that is the end of chapter 16, and I'm desperately needing to stop talking here in a second. But does anybody have any questions before I pass out? Steve? Yeah. Yeah. There's. Yeah. I suspect Paul picked up on the idea here and used it as a 180 because he used similar language. But you're right, Steve. So as Steve was mentioning in 1 Corinthians when Paul's writing, he uses a similar concept of the "O death." The New King James says, "I'll be your plague." "O grave, I'll be your destruction." But he uses it in a positive light in the Christian era because the death and the grave doesn't have any power over us through Christ. But at that time, when Hosea is writing it, God has the power over it, and their outlook, or their future is not boding well for their future as far as the death and the grave go. Any other thoughts or questions? All right, I will let you go a minute or two early, and I'll go to the bathroom. All right, thanks for coming, everybody.
Jesus gave his life a ransom yonder on Calvary.